Alright, so now we're going to jump into part two of our lecture on reinforcement, feedback, and intrinsic motivation, which is going to really heavily dominate this part of the lecture. So intrinsic motivation. A lot of us know what it is. These are some cheesy pictures to kind of help us out with it. But intrinsic motivation is literally doing activity for the sheer enjoyment and the feeling of doing the activity. Now, I have a short video here. I'd like you guys to take a second. Go ahead, go and watch this. It's a little bit old. Excuse me, I think it's from 2008 or so. But just think about the reasons that all of these athletes state that they play sport. You'll notice that a lot of them are different. A lot of times it's social, sometimes it's for fun, sometimes it's to learn new skills. So a lot of the things that we've already talked about, but what's also important is really they all seem to do this because they just get this uh, sheer enjoyment from being physically active or engaging in their sport. So intrinsic motivation, what is it? Well, people who are intrinsically motivated strive inwardly. So these are the folks who are very task or mastery focused. So they like to feel competent. They like to have some self of or sense of self-determination in their quest or in their journey for learning and mastering new skills. Okay, so they enjoy competition. They like the action, all the excitement that comes with it, but they also love the feeling, the fun that they derive from activity. Now, here's kind of a crazy depiction. It's in your book about intrinsic motivation, and it's really this pretty intense spectrum. So here on the left we have amotivation. Amotivation is literally a complete is a state where we lack any motivation whatsoever. But as we begin to work into this spectrum, as we start to move to the right, external regulation comes up. This is a form of extrinsic motivation. So these are all for external reasons or rewards. So external regulation is literally, it's completely controlled by some external source or something like a reward. Then introjected, there's some internal reasons for being physically active or doing something, uh, but the behavior still isn't really self-determined. So when we say self-determined, we really mean autonomous, where the person or the individual is engaging in activity for their own reasons, completely inherent to themselves. Identified, again, as we go further to the right, we're becoming more and more self-determined. So identified, the activity or behavior is highly valued, it's accepted, it can be judged by the individual, um, but it's not always an activity that the person wants to do or really derives enjoyment from. Then we have introject or integrated, excuse me. So now it's another form of extrinsic motivation where the person feels the behavior is important, it has some kind of valued outcome, uh, rather than it being interesting, um, or doing it just for itself. So it's still not quite completely autonomous. But once we go into stimulation, accomplishment, and knowledge, which really are all clumped into just what is intrinsic motivation, we're really talking about doing a task for specific goals to the person. So it doesn't involve anything external. So stimulation is the person engages in an activity to experience some pleasant sensation. So something like fun or enjoyment. The accomplishment element is the person's doing the activity for the pleasure and satisfaction they feel from mastering some kind of skill. And then the last one, knowledge. The individual engages in activity for pleasure and satisfaction still, but this has to do with learning and exploring and trying to understand something new. So what are some elements that might be influencing intrinsic motivation? Well, there's definitely some social factors. Pretty simple things like success and failure. So if we're successful, the individual tends to be more intrinsically motivated. You tend to have more fun and enjoy physical activity when you're winning or doing well with it as opposed to failing. The focus on competition. So again, are we focused on competition with ourselves and our own personal development, or are we focused on competitiveness and social comparisons? If we're focused on ourselves and task mastery and having fun uh, along with competition, then we're going to see some peaks in intrinsic motivation. But if all we're doing is socially comparing and focusing on some outcome, then the intrinsic motivation is not going to be as high as it could be. And the last one here is a coach's behavior. Is the coach trying to develop athletes, develop skilled individuals, or are they really just focused in on, winning a game, winning a trophy? Is it all about proving that your team's better than another? While that can be fun, it's not always the most intrinsically motivating climate for athletes to be situated in. Now, there's also some psychological factors that are going to influence intrinsic motivation, so competence, autonomy, and relatedness. And these are really derived from self-determination theory, which the book doesn't get into really in depth. But basically, it says the more competent, more autonomous, and more related you feel, the more likely you're going to be intrinsically motivated. Now, if any of these are lacking, then you're not going to be as optimally intrinsically motivated as you could be. Okay, and I think that kind of makes sense. If you don't feel that your abilities are very high, although you're in complete control and you're there with your friends in sport, you're enjoying the social element and having some control, but the odds are you would be more intrinsically motivated or derive more enjoyment from the activity if you were more competent. So how does intrinsic motivation really interact or go along with these extrinsic rewards? And so the question is, are rewards going to undermine intrinsic motivation? And basically what the research suggests is that being paid for working on something that's interesting to you can actually decrease your motivation or your intrinsic motivation. So to some degree, yes. Yes. An extrinsic motivation or form, or extrinsic reward can actually debunk your intrinsic motivation. And there have been some studies on this. So the SOMA puzzles, the study here, basically the researcher asked kids to, he put kids into three conditions where they were given a reward, um, you know, they were, expecting a reward, not expecting a reward, but given one, and then no reward. And they actually found that individuals that were given a reward, if they were asked to do the same task later on, they actually did it less. And this had to do with puzzles. So they actually saw the individuals decreasing in likelihood of engaging in doing these puzzles. Now, the leper and green study kind of did the same thing, but looked at kids that were given um, that were given a drawing task. So again, the kids were observed and looked at their behavior to see, okay, if we give them a reward, are we going to see the same effects as if we didn't give them a reward, or if we gave them a reward they weren't expecting? And again, what they found was that by giving some external award, it actually dampened or decreased the kids' intrinsic motivation on the task. So this kind of leads us to this cognitive evaluation theory that they go over a bit in the book. There's a lot of detail here, but this basically says how it has to do with how rewards are perceived. It is critical when we're determining the intrinsic motivation of individuals, whether things are going, the intrinsic motivation is going to increase or decrease. And this is really focused in on two elements. There is a third element we'll talk about, but what we're going to talk about is the controlling aspect. So rewards are perceived to control a person, and this decreases their motivation or their intrinsic motivation, whereas rewards that contribute to an internal locus of causality or control will increase internal or intrinsic motivation. So if you look at table 1, or excuse me, page 143 in the textbook, there's a table that kind of goes over this. So it talks about, is there perceived locus of causality? Is it something, is the cause of behavior something outside of the person? Well, then their intrinsic motivation is going to be low. If the cause of the behavior is something that comes from within the person, then their intrinsic motivation will be higher. And this same kind of pattern goes along with the informational aspect. So rewards that provide information and positive feedback about competence are going to increase intrinsic motivation, whereas rewards that suggest a person is not competent are going to decrease their feelings of intrinsic motivation. So the third component that you should be aware of as well, though, is this functional significance of the event. So how a reward is going to affect intrinsic motivation really depends on whether the recipient perceives it to be more controlling or more informational. So the thinking here is really how the person perceives this element of control and information. So let's use the example of football scholarships, or actually let's do college scholarships in general for athletics. There's been some work done that actually shows that football scholarship athletes are less intrinsically motivated than other sport or athletic scholarship earners. And that's simply because a lot of times scholarships are used as a element of control for football players. Okay, an athlete will play if they have a scholarship. Okay, whereas in other sports, so usually the non-revenue generating sports, so something like wrestling, cross country, track, whatever it might be, scholarships in those areas actually are seen as more informational. They tend to convey to the athlete that they are competent and they excel in their sport or event, whatever it might be. Okay, so those individuals tend to be more intrinsically motivated. So how do extrinsic rewards affect intrinsic motivation in sport? So like I just said, scholarships is one form of this. So athletic scholarships can either decrease or increase athletes' intrinsic motivation. So it really depends on how it's perceived. Is it used as an implement of control or a source of information of competence? Now, when we think about competitive success and failure, these are actually two great sources of information for athletes as well. So these can definitely kind of add or also affect our level of internal or intrinsic motivation. So the basic finding has been, and I don't think it'll be any shocker to anyone, is that success tends to lead to more intrinsic motivation, whereas failure does not. And then this last part here has to do with feedback and intrinsic motivation. And again, I don't think it's that big of a shock, but basically positive feedback tends to increase intrinsic motivation. So what are some other determinants of intrinsic motivation? So we've talked about some, the controlling aspect, the informational aspect. Well, we happen to know that playing for a certain type of coach can lead to more, or excuse me, better levels of intrinsic motivation. So if the coach is more autonomous or democratic just in their style versus someone who's controlling and authoritative and all of this, there tends to be a higher level of intrinsic motivation. Also participating in rec leagues as opposed to extremely competitive leagues. High versus low perceived competence. I don't think that should be anything surprising. And then the perceived control as well. We've talked about competence and control a good bit. But also high versus low social benefits tends to lead to different values in intrinsic motivation. Now we're going to kind of shift gears and take intrinsic motivation to a whole different level, and that's into something called flow. And most people consider flow to be a special case of intrinsic motivation, but it's really this idea of something probably a lot of us have experienced, but it's when we're in the zone in sports. It's when it seems like everything's going our way. It's almost like we're having an out-of-body experience. Our movements are just automatic. We're not even thinking about it. So flow is a holistic, intrinsically motivating sensation that people feel when they're totally involved in an activity. So it's really this idea of being on autopilot. And there is a model that describes this. We'll talk about that in just a little bit. Oh, I thought there was an actual model, excuse me. So what are the elements of flow? Well, there's a lot. The book is going to go into a lot more detail than I am here. But the essential elements are balance of challenges and skills. So if you're going to achieve flow, you want to be highly skilled and also in a very challenging situation. So that way your skills are matching the demands of the task. You want to be completely absorbed in the activity. So they talk about, I believe they use a rock climber in here a bit in the textbook, and they talk about how you really just become part of the activity. Your goals are clear. You're merging. There's a merging of action and awareness. So it's where you're not really thinking about the task. It's just things are happening. Okay, you don't have to be aware of the cues in your environment and having a secondary action. You don't have to think and do. Things are just happening at the same time. You're totally concentrated on the task, although it doesn't seem burdensome. It seems easy and simple for you to achieve any task or skill that needs to be done. There tends to be a loss of self-consciousness. So they tend to just lose their ego. They just become completely immersed in what's going on around them. They lose all sense of control, as in they're not under someone's control, which is important. They're not worried about this lack of control or anything like that. There aren't really any goals or rewards external to the activity, so again the person is completely immersed in the activity. Time seems to go slower. So this is people are in flow when they talk about everything seemed to slow down while playing the sport. Or even some golfers talk about, oh, when I was in the zone, I could just the golf ball seemed as big as a beach ball, and the cup was a yard around. Okay, so they're just on a different level, it seems like. And then there's also this idea of just effortless movement, which kind of links with this self-awareness element and action, where it just seems like things are happening. It really, it's hard to describe all of this, but it's almost like an out-of-body experience. So here's a figure that kind of talks about this and the trade-off of what kind of challenging situation the athlete is exposed to, and then where their skill level is. So ideally, an athlete's going to achieve flow if their skills are high and they're put into a situation that demands their skills to be high. So it's kind of a sweet spot, if you will, where skills and the challenge are kind of synced together. So ideally, athletes would be able to be in flow at all times, right? Well, research actually shows us that you can't control flow. A lot of times you'll slip into it and slip out of it, and it's not simply a switch that can be turned on and off. But some athletes do believe that they can actually increase the probability of achieving flow. Now the book does a great job of this. There's a lot of these factors in the text. Again, read a good chunk of these. It's on page 150 to about 153. So look at some of the factors that allow people to improve the likelihood that they're going to achieve flow. So this is these are things like their motivation, their arousal level, what they're focused on, their pre competition and competitive plans and preparation. So think about all of these different elements. Just because they're here in the book doesn't make it an exhaustive list as well, because flow, the experience of flow is different for virtually every person. Now also, take a look at the table on page 153 and look at some of the factors that are going to disrupt flow or just altogether stop athletes from really being able to achieve a flow state. So this could be things like not really being physically prepared, so maybe you're injured, you're tired, whatever it might be. They're not confident in their skills. What else do we have here? They're not motivated. They don't have goals. Then there's things that could disrupt. If you're in flow, things that could disrupt you. So what if you all of a sudden start focusing on the wrong things, or focusing on every element of a movement as opposed to just letting the action take its course? So again, read through these and don't think of this as an exhaustive list. These are just there's research supporting these ones, but that doesn't mean that these elements of flow or distractors from flow really create the entire list, because there definitely are some other possibilities out there. All right, that's the end of part 2 on our chapter of feedback, reinforcement, and intrinsic motivation. When you get a moment, make sure you go on and do the 4-point activity associated with this chapter. Thanks, guys.